as a consultant on the motor team in April 2015. He now holds the title of senior consultant. As a senior member of the motor team, Matthew fields questions from employees and employers regarding their rights and responsibilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act and assists in identifying accommodation solutions for employees with motor and mobility impairments. He also writes for Jan on various ADA and accommodation topics. Matthew earned a Master of Science degree in Rehabilitation Counseling from West Virginia University, and a Bachelor of Science degree in Psychology from Fairmont University. He is nationally certified by the Commission on Rehabilitation Counselor Certification as a certified rehabilitation counselor. Matthew has experience providing classroom accommodations to college students with disabilities and it provides mental health therapy services to college students regardless of their disability status. Matthew.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I forgot. The IR Kids Join the Fight fundraiser is online, galabid.com. I mean, the link, I should have gotten an email with it. Okay, well, they'll be sending one out on that little app. We'll give you a notification how you can do it. There's also a table set up downstairs in the back corner that has the information on it. If you have any questions after this on. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Before we get started, I just wanted to get a feel for the room. I have plenty of examples built into the presentation, so if not a whole lot of people have questions, I can go through those so we have more content. But if you guys have a lot of questions, I can always skip over those examples to give as much time for questions at the end as possible. So would people like to have as much time for questions, or would you like to have the full content of the presentation? Content. Okay, we'll go through the content then. That's totally fine. All right, so to give a little overview of what we're going to do today, I'm going to start off with the services that my business, Jan, provides to people. Then we're going to go through disability disclosure, talk about some common misconceptions, and give some tips on how people can disclose their disability and request accommodations as effectively as possible. Then we'll go through Jan's sample interactive process, and we'll end off with some best practices for stay at work and return to work programs. So, intro to Jan. Jan was established back in 1983. We are a free national consulting service that provides guidance on ADA Title I, ADA Amendments Act, and on its related legislation. We also provide confidential and expert consulting services on job accommodation issues. So we help people brainstorm ideas on what sort of accommodations might help a particular client. And of course, we are a service of the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy. So, practical guidance and technical assistance, what does that mean? So basically, we kind of meet you where you are in the process. If you happen to be calling for yourself, we will help you understand ADA 101. What are your rights? What are your obligations? What do you need to do to get those accommodations? If you're calling us as a voc rehab professional, we can help you educate your clients on those things. But if you're also calling on behalf of an employer, or if you are an employer, we help you understand your obligations on what that means for ADA compliance. We also provide services for individuals with disabilities for self-employment and entrepreneurship options. We have a dedicated team for that too. So if any of your clients feel like they might be better off with starting their own business, we have a team dedicated to helping with that too. And of course, all of our services are completely free to our customers. So how is Jan structured? So basically, we have two main types of service providers at Jan. We have employment specialists who help individuals with disabilities and their family members specifically. And then we have consultants like me. And consultants take calls from any client that calls us, but we are broken up into specialized teams. Those teams are our ADA team, our cognitive neurological team, our motor team, which is the one that I am on, our sensory team, and our self-employment team. So if you call into us and one of the people that answers the phone asks for what is the disability involved with the case, this is the reason why. They want to make certain you're talking to the proper person. Who can get our services? Basically anyone, but these are the ones that we get the most often. employees with disabilities, their family members, employers, and lots of supporting professionals like attorneys or medical doctors or voc rehab professionals. We do, of course, take calls from other professionals as well. School counselors call in a lot, but those are the main ones. Okay, so that's a brief overview of Jan. So let's go ahead and move on to disability disclosure. So first and foremost, what I always suggest that we help our clients understand is to understand how the disability impacts our ability to do our jobs. After all, some people feel like they need to disclose at the outset, even if they don't need accommodations. They need to put it on the form. They don't necessarily have to do that. If they can do the job without any accommodations, they don't have to disclose. Even if the application makes it seem mandatory, they do not. They are more than welcome to not disclose if they don't need accommodations. But if they do need accommodations, then it's important for them to understand how it impacts their ability to work, because that is the whole point of the accommodation, to help them overcome those barriers. Another thing that we always want to point out up front is it's important for them to be knowledgeable on their own rights, but also on their employer's obligations. The reasons why we suggest that is so that way our clients are best able to identify whenever things are going awry. So they know whenever things are going south, they know how to identify it as quickly as possible. And of course, just like with any other situation, we are not an island. We want to leverage the resources that we have, which could be the Jan service. It can be you all. It can be a lot of different people. It's very tempting for our clients to feel like they have to go it alone or that they have no choice but to go it alone, and that's just simply not true. Okay, so we need to define what we're talking about. What is a disability disclosure? Essentially, it's whenever someone gives private medical information about their own needs to someone else, which can be purposeful whenever they're asking for an accommodation, or it can be passive, like whenever someone is just chatting during lunch and talking about how their back impairment is making it hard for them to sleep at night. Both of those are disability disclosures. Just one of them happens to be for social reasons instead of an accommodation reason. So why do we want to disclose? Obviously, we need to disclose in order to ask for the accommodations, or maybe because our client feels like they're not getting a fair shake of what sort of things other people have. Maybe they might be not being able to participate in a particular luncheon because they have a gluten allergy, and the main thing on the menu is pizza. That's another situation where we might want to disclose. And of course, if we have some sort of unusual circumstance that might require some leave time, that's an important time to discuss that as well. If we need to take medical leave, we need to explain why we need that medical leave. So here's a couple myths, common myths and truths and misunderstandings on disability disclosures that a lot of clients have. First of all, applicants do not have to disclose their need for accommodation during hiring, like I said before. A lot of those applications make it seem mandatory, and it is not. They don't need accommodations, they do not have to. Number two, an employee can't request accommodations if they didn't disclose during hiring. This is kind of like along the lines of number one, but a lot of employers feel like if the individual does not disclose during hire, that they can't request accommodations later. And that is just simply not true. Number three, the individual doesn't need to share their medical information with anyone to get an accommodation. A lot of employees think about this. They think that it's their own medical information. They shouldn't have to tell anyone. And that's just not true. Employers do have a right to gather some information on the medical needs so that they can confirm that the individual meets the definition of disability and needs the accommodations being requested because of that disability. So they're not allowed to ask for everything. They can't ask for the entire medical history or anything that's unrelated, but they can ask for some things. Okay, so here is just kind of some typical conversation guidelines, for an employer to help them understand what's going on. So sometimes employees ask for or share information without actually going through with requesting the accommodation. They'll bring up the fact that they're having this problem or that problem, but they won't actually follow through. And a lot of employers are like, well, what do I do with that? You're telling me this information, but you're not asking for anything. So how do I move forward? Do I just ignore that? Is this just information that you're giving me? So what we would suggest at Jan is no one shares this sort of information unless there is a reason for them to do it. There might be a couple people out there that are more than willing to talk about their disabilities with anyone who has an ear to listen, but most people just don't do that. So if someone is disclosing, they're probably in need of an accommodation. So it's totally fine to ask them. If they have disclosed to you, it's perfectly fine to ask, thank you for telling me this information. Are you needing some kind of change at work because of this issue? That's totally fine. And of course, it can be even muddier because some individuals don't identify as people with disabilities. There is, of course, a stigma that goes along with this stuff. Not everyone likes to be associated with that, and that's okay. Not everyone wants to take on a label, and that's not a problem. So if they don't use specific lingo, if they don't say, I have a disability, or if they don't say the Americans with Disabilities Act or accommodation or anything like that, that doesn't mean that the request isn't still valid. They don't have to use the magic words. Here's our first situation and solution. Our individual here is Rhonda. She has depression and needs to ask for an accommodation for a flexible schedule because her new medication is making it so she can't make it to work on time. She has missed 3 days in a row now, but she is wary of disclosing her needs, but she's concerned about getting disciplinary action for her tardiness. So in this situation, we encouraged Rhonda to disclose and provide medical information on her needs. And the outcome of that disclosure was that her work didn't really depend upon her being around whenever other people were working too. So they were more than fine to let her have a flexible schedule to tend into these side effects of her medication, as long as she stays within those core business operating hours of 8 to 6. So it was a perfectly easy situation once she got over that roadblock in her head. So just some closing tips, some overview of this particular topic. Remember that there isn't a timeline where anyone has to disclose unless they need an accommodation. So you don't have to disclose too soon, but also remember, you don't want to disclose too late. If performance problems arise, we want to disclose before those become an issue, because if the individual waits too long and the individual gets disciplinary action on their record, the employer doesn't have to rescind that disciplinary action because the individual chose to wait too long. But that's the main takeaway from all this, is that there's not a specific timeline, but we do want to keep all of this in mind so we disclose when it is most advantageous to us. Okay, so now that we've gone through that, let's go over the interactive process. So first and foremost, it's important to keep in mind. Yes, sir. Sure. An accommodation is essentially any kind of modification in the job because of a disability. So it's not like it has to be anything super formal. It doesn't have to be a piece of furniture. It doesn't have to be any one particular thing. It's any kind of adjustment to that job because of a medical need. It's a good question. Any other questions before we move on? It certainly can, yes. So one thing that we want to keep in mind is that individuals have protections under various laws, right? So FMLA is one way people can get medical leave, but it's not the only way people can get medical leave. So if someone has FMLA time, but they also request an accommodation, how does the employer handle that? What we suggest is we review that situation under FMLA, we review it under ADA, any other laws that apply, and then the employer needs to choose whichever one gives that individual the most protection. They don't have to use magic words for any of those laws to apply, so they need to be aware of what can apply and what is going to be best for any given situation. It's a good question. Anyone else? Don't be shy. Okay, so sample interactive process. One of the issues here is that though an interactive process is very helpful and the EEOC and other agencies definitely heavily encourage it be used, no federal agency has given any sort of a guideline on what it looks like. So we here at Jan created a sample. It is, of course, just a sample that we made to make things easier on everyone. So if you don't like it, you don't have to use it. That's totally fine. But if you do like it, and you want to make some tweaks, that's also fine too. However you want to structure this, this is just a guide. So our guideline, these are the 6 steps that we encourage you to follow. Recognizing that request, gathering needed information, exploring the accommodation options, choosing the accommodation, implementing it, and monitoring it. So let's go into step number 1. So requesting an accommodation. How do we recognize that? So we want to, if we're not sure, we want to err on the side of caution. This is just the first step. And a lot of employers get lost at this step because they get bogged down with, oh, but does this person really meet the ADA's definition of disability? Is their needs really severe enough to count? And we do a lot of waffling there. Yes.
So what about that? Do you think it's appropriate for an employer to confirm they meet the criteria definition of the ADA?
So if we're talking legally,
I'm talking about from a compliance perspective, the HR department. We're not attorneys, so we're not complying with the law, we're complying with our policy.
right. So in that situation, it's totally fine if we want to have these people go through the same processes that we require everyone else, but there are some caveats to that. First and foremost, and this is something I was going to discuss later, but good reason to talk about it now. First and foremost, we want to remember that whenever someone requests an accommodation, the employer has a right to gather that medical documentation. But there are some caveats there. Employers, like we said, don't have a right to gather everything. So we need to make certain that they do actually need it. You know, if the individual has requested time under, say, FMLA or requested time through an internal leave program, it's entirely possible the employer has some notes floating around somewhere that discusses that disability, and those notes should not be ignored. If the employer already has enough information on hand because the individual's needs are obvious, you know, person in a wheelchair requesting a ramp, obvious. We have a lot of notes floating around because of various leave requests this person has had. We don't want to ignore that either, just like we wouldn't request the obvious stuff. And if we have enough information to move forward with this request and recognize it and process it based on what we already have, we don't want to bog the process down by asking for information we already know. So that's what we would encourage.
I'm just asking you a simple question. There's nothing in the ADA law that prevents an employer from saying, tell me what your disability is, I want the definition.
If we're talking ADA from a federal perspective, no. State laws, though, do apply. So some states state, no, you're not allowed to ask for that diagnosis. I don't know all of them, but I know in particular, California is one where it's not allowed.
And they said, in what regulation did they say you can't ask that question?
It was a state level law that they used to expand on the ADA. I'm not sure.
You're talking about FEHA, you're not talking about ADA.
No, we're talking state laws.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
What if an employer has disability disclosure to them, but if the person doesn't want any accommodation?
Okay.
How do they navigate if they need to give them, if the person doesn't want it?
Right.
They protect those entities?
Yep. In that situation, obviously, the first thing that employer wants to do is document it. So, you know, we got this disclosure, we asked if they need an accommodation and they declined. So document that. That's totally fine. That's what happened. We want to have that on file, though, so that way if the person comes back later and says, actually, yeah, I do need an accommodation for that. I didn't think I needed it, but I do. So in that situation, if that information is still relevant, we want to use it because it's still valid. But if it's not valid, we can gather some updates on that. You know, maybe there's a duration that's changed. Maybe the needs have changed. We can get those updates as we need them, but we don't want to ignore what we already have. Any other things? Okay. So second point here is we need to act quickly. And the reason for that is under the ADA, there isn't a set timeline that we need to follow. Like there isn't a 30-day, 60-day, 90-day requirement that these requests be processed within, but there are timeliness requirements. And the major one there is we don't want to impose unnecessary delays, because imposing that unnecessary delay can be a violation. So if we are genuinely working on it as quickly as possible and the delays that are imposed are ones that we can't avoid, that's okay. And how we can prevent that from happening is by the last 2 points. We want to assign at least one person whose job it is to know how to navigate this process at the employer. And we also want to conduct training so that our supervisors know, I think I might have gotten an accommodation request. Who do I send that along to? Or how do I identify it so I can confirm that it is one to pass it along? That sort of a thing. So here's our first example for step 1. We have an employee who is on FMLA, and she let her employer know that after her 12 weeks of FMLA run out, she's going to need some more time to continue recovering from her knee surgery. Is that an accommodation request? Yes, it absolutely is, because we know that there is an accommodation of leave needed after FMLA runs out, and we know that it is because of that medical condition. Those are the only 2 points we need for it to count as an accommodation request. Okay, step 2, gathering information. So like we were talking about before, gather what is needed to understand the problem, but no more. We need to understand those needs, how they require the accommodations. We don't need anything specific to other extraneous variables. We're only gathering information on what requires the accommodation. Number 2, don't ask the healthcare provider to explain things that the individual can explain themselves. So in this situation, this is a way that we would encourage employers to handle it, because it's going to keep that process moving forward as quickly as possible.
So you're not suggesting employers should talk to healthcare providers directly, right?
If the individual gives them consent to do that, that's totally fine. But what I'm saying here is that we want to keep the process moving along at a brisk pace. So if we know that the individual knows their needs best and that we're not really questioning if they actually meet the definition or not, we don't need medical confirmation. We're just gathering information on how does your lifting impairment impact your ability to do your job. We probably don't need the doctor to weigh in on any of that, because the individual is the one who's actually doing it.
I would suggest that's not correct, that we want objective data to support every single statement of disability with a restriction.
And that's totally fine.
If you let one employee not provide objective data to support what is coming out of their mouth about how disabled they are, you have to let all employees not do that. So you don't want to do that.
I mean,
My recommendation.
and that's totally fine. That's totally fine. I'm not saying that we have to forego this information. I'm stating that if we want to make certain that we're going along at a brisk pace and we don't need a doctor to confirm that the individual is being truthful, we might as well just trust what the individual is saying. Yes, ma'am.
Is it part of the amendment that it can be a temporary thing?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So the way that I would encourage you to think about that is that the ADA did not explicitly forbid temporary accommodations. Like there wasn't anything in the law that clearly stated 6 months or less, not an ADA. That's just how people interpreted it and how it was enforced until the Amendments Act. So when the Amendments Act came out, it explicitly stated that no, temporary needs can be covered if they're severe enough to qualify. Essentially, that duration is just one piece of evidence that we take into consideration. It's not the end all be all. It's not a cutoff. Any other questions? Okay. So, and of course, we need to remember our ADA confidentiality rules for medical inquiries. Like we said, we don't want to ask for too much. We don't want to ask for things that are not related. We want to keep things focused on what we are looking for and what we need to know to move forward. Okay, so a little bit of specific information on medical documentation. Obviously, if an individual requests an accommodation, we don't want to ask for that stuff if it is already known or obvious. The EEOC has been pretty clear in their guidance documents that when the need is already known or obvious, employers don't have a right to gather that. The reason why we're gathering that information is to confirm that the individual meets the definition of disability, a medical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. That's the question that we're looking to answer. And of course, if there is ever a question, we can ask for medical documentation to verify that need for an accommodation. If the link between the disability and the accommodation doesn't make sense, we can ask for the doctor to help us understand why it's needed. And of course, our confidentiality rules. We don't want to be talking about this stuff with anyone that doesn't need to know it, but there are some people that we can tell about this information. So that could be supervisors or other people in a position of management who might need to know to implement the accommodation or might need to know about the restrictions so that way they can tailor the work that they're giving them to fit with the medical need. We can also provide this information to our first aid personnel in the event of an emergency or if the individual needs help getting out of a burning building. Obviously, it's totally fine to disclose to those people at that time. It's very important to do so. And of course, we want to let our government officials who are investigating ADA compliance know whenever they're asking for it. And we can also provide information to workers' compensation people and our insurance agencies as well. Before we move into step 2, does anyone have any questions or the example for step 2 anyway? Briefly went over that medical documentation stuff, so I wanted to make certain there wasn't any lingering questions. Okay, so example for step 2, a newly hired custodian uses a service animal to alert her when she's having a seizure, but she did not disclose during the phone interview and thought it would be okay to tell her supervisor on her first day at work. However, this employer has a no animal policy. Does this employer have everything that they need to know? No, they do not. And the reason why here is, number one, we didn't discuss any workplace barrier that requires the animal. All we have is the individual's word on that. So we can gather some medical documentation to confirm that need is legitimate. And number two, we don't have any information to confirm that the service animal actually is a service animal. We don't know if it's just a pet or not. And if we're providing an accommodation, we need to make certain it's going to be effective. So we need to make certain it's properly trained to identify these seizures if we're going to allow it on job and modify this no animal policy. Okay, so step 3, exploring accommodation options. Number 1, we want to keep an open mind. One thing I always like to say here. Oh, yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering, because this comes up as social security.
Yeah.
Did the person tell the employer that they had seizures?
No, for this particular case, they didn't discuss anything about their medical needs at all.
So what happens is, the judge will say, this person has a seizure once a month. I mean, a seizure, a grand mal seizure is like a big event.
Mm-hmm.
And how does it affect the workplace? I think that this is an important issue.
Yeah.
Do employers, if they hired somebody and then found out that they had seizures,
Mhm.
they can't they can't fire that person. However, if the person continues to have these seizures and disrupts the work.
Yeah.
What happens here?
So one thing that comes up in that situation is the determination of a direct threat. So, whenever we're concerned about safety, which a lot of the times whenever there's an unexplained grand mal seizure that's going on at work, there's going to be questions about safety. So we would want to review that, which is its own process, but that's the process that we can use where if the individual is very resistant to accommodations, where the employer can require that they be put into place, even if the individual does not want them. So direct threat, like I said, is its whole thing, but that's how we determine, is this a significant risk of substantial harm to the individual or those around them? And is there any way that we can accommodate that objectively verifiable safety risk so it's not going to pose a huge burden to the business?
And is there an accommodation that would?
It depends on the situation, of course.
Yeah.
If the individual does have a service animal like this person does that's trained on how to identify it, we can set up a plan of action for how to identify once those warning signs are being seen by the service animal, how to get the person into a safe place where they can have that seizure at work without potentially hurting themselves, things like that. Obviously, we can't prevent the seizures from happening at work. They're going to happen when they're going to happen. We can reduce triggers to make them happen less often, but there is always that possibility. So if that happens, we want to have a plan for how to handle it so it's safe and everyone has their needs met.
So if the person did not inform the prospective employer before they got hired,
Mhm.
and so they were hired under false pretense in a way, can that employer then terminate this person, or what
No.
happens? Yeah.
No, they wouldn't be able to terminate them because they didn't disclose. Remember, like we talked about before, the employee is not obligated to disclose, but if they don't disclose and they get disciplinary action on their record or something happens, they don't have to rescind that either. So simply terminating the person because they didn't disclose and request an accommodation, we definitely wouldn't want to do that. But we would want to take this information and say, oh, okay, there's obviously an accommodation need here. Let's talk about that. How can we accommodate you to make it so this isn't an issue for us moving forward?
I missed the beginning, sorry about that.
Oh, no, you're fine. Any other questions? Okay. Loving this energy. I love the back and forth. Please don't hesitate to ask any questions. Okay. So obviously, if we're exploring accommodation options, the individual probably knows something that they use in their personal life that they could turn over at work and get a similar thing there. That's totally fine to ask for those suggestions if they have them. But if they don't have them, it's totally fine to consult with our service providers like us here, like us at Jan, our medical providers. All of these people can provide some options if they have that understanding of the needs. They could certainly provide suggestions too to make life easier for the employer. Of course, it's not to say that it's the service provider's job to do this. Obviously it is the employer's responsibility to figure out what the accommodations are going to be, but they don't have to do it alone. And if those service providers or us here at Jan or anything like that can make it easier, all the better. We want to make this as simple as possible for everyone involved, right? We want to make certain these accommodations are put into place. So, yes, ma'am.
What if the employer is a small business, financially they can always meet the accommodations? Are there certain services or opportunities that they can navigate to try to make?
So there are some, obviously, if it's an undue hardship because this accommodation is going to cost like thousands of dollars and it's just not in the budget anywhere, there is the possibility of our state voc rehab. If the individual is eligible for those services, sometimes they can help pay. Our Centers for Independent Living in the area could potentially help to pay. Our state level assistive technology projects have loan programs through them. So if we're needing to buy a specific piece of equipment, we could potentially talk to them about that. Some of them also have grants as well. So those would be the things that we would be talking about if the employer can't provide it due to that undue hardship. Good question though. Anyone else? Okay. So for our example for step 3, a social worker with use of only one hand has requested an assistant to do all of her keyboarding for her case notes for her as an accommodation. So obviously that could be an effective accommodation. It might help this person quite a lot, but how can that employer figure out what else might work for them? So in this situation, we did get this call at Jan, and what we suggested was, number 1, we want to try to perform an ergonomic assessment to make certain that there is any other variables that are getting in the way here. But naturally, we want to provide things that are specific to the need, and that's what the ergonomic assessment is for, in case the individual doesn't know everything that they need. But for this particular issue of the keyboarding, we suggested speech recognition software for those longer case notes, and also a specialized one-handed keyboard and a foot pedal mouse for shorter typing tasks. And that worked out very well for the individual. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question because I get this scenario a lot.
Mhm.
And, in terms of using the one-handed keyboard and the foot pedal, do they have to go through like a certain period where they train on this equipment?
We would encourage that. Yeah, we would encourage there being a training period, because obviously if the individual has no experience in using these very different input devices from what they're used to, there's going to be needing some time to figure out how to use them. But there isn't really a standard amount of time. It's going to depend upon the individual's ability on how easily they're going to be able to pick it up. So we would want to provide an amount of training time, but of course be open to extensions if the individual needs more time. Yes, sir. We do have vendor listings that we can send along. They're not going to be tailored to a specific location since we take calls from across the country, but we do have a listing of vendors that sell products like this. So you can at least kind of get a feel for what you're looking for, kind of get a feel for what a typical price could be, stuff like that, to make it easier for you to find those vendors and stuff like that. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I just wanted to, in this particular situation, just briefly, I actually had one like this, and that was old-fashioned. We used the center.
Great.
One actually, yeah.
Awesome. I love to hear about that. Centers for Independent Living are one of those things that I suggest quite a lot. And a lot of people are like, what's a Center for Independent Living? I'm like, oh, you poor thing. They're so helpful. Please contact them. They can be so helpful. Just like the state assistive technology projects, so helpful.
They had like 50 pieces.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. I love them. I always refer to them anytime that I can because I love to get people in contact with resources like that. Hello. I think my clicker might be dead. There we go. Okay. All right, so step 4, choosing the accommodation. So of course, we want to give the requested option that the individual actually asked for primary consideration. You know, everyone likes to choose the things that they want. You know, we all like to have the specific office furniture that we like. That's totally fine. If they ask for something specific, we want to give that one the first review. But ultimately, the employer is the one that gets to choose what they are going to provide. So if the individual asks for something that costs couple $100 more than one that you can find with the same features, it's totally fine for the employer to say, we're going to get you the one that's cheaper because it's just as effective. And if we're not sure what's going to be helpful for this individual, we don't really have any way to know without trying it out. Let's set up a trial period. Let's write up a little agreement where we're going to say we're going to test this out for a couple weeks, a month or two. Then we're going to revisit it and see how it is so we can gather some data on how effective this is for you. That's totally fine too. Sometimes we just need that real world data to figure out if it's going to actually work. Okay, so for our example for step 4, a customer service representative with diabetes had a strong body odor. He requested to work from home because his job could actually be done remotely. But the employer was concerned about isolating the employee by having the work from home be the accommodation. So they were considering other things like installing some cubicle walls and air purifiers and stuff like that to accommodate the individual. So this actually is a surprisingly tricky situation that we took here on this call, because obviously it's totally understandable for the employer not to want to segregate a person with a disability. Having them work from home whenever other people don't work from home could potentially be seen as unnecessary segregation. So how do we navigate that sort of a situation? The best way to navigate that is to talk with the individual. How do they feel about it? Do they feel like they are being excluded or not? And in this situation, the individual did not feel like they were being excluded. They wanted the work from home. They didn't feel like they were being excluded at all. And in fact, the options that the employer were considering with those cubicle walls and those air purifiers, they actually thought that that would single them out more by drawing more attention to their disability than if they just weren't there at all. So in those sort of situations, we want to have that open dialogue so we can navigate through them in real time. Okay. So step 5, implementing the accommodation. So we want to make certain that we've done everything that we need to do to implement that accommodation. Sometimes, you know, we get busy in our HR departments and we make the purchase and we send it along and like, oh, okay, we're done, right? Well, not necessarily, because that thing might have been shipped in a box and needs to be assembled. The individual might need training on how to use it, like you were talking about before. Those are all important to do in order to implement the accommodation. We need to make certain that it's usable. Obviously, we only want to have our essential personnel be informed of the accommodation, the people that need to know, like if we're talking about a sit-stand desk or an ergonomic chair, we might need to inform facilities so they know why there's a big box being sent up to this person's office, right? Or the person might need help setting up that sit-stand desk, which facilities would probably take care of, right? So they would need to know, but random coworker from 3 offices down that's just curious doesn't need to know why this person is getting a new desk. So we don't want to tell people that don't know, don't need to know. And of course, we want to have a point of contact established so that way the individual can raise concerns about it. If this particular option is different from what they wanted and they see it doesn't have a key feature that they needed, so they can talk about that with that point of contact so that way maybe something else can be provided or something can be added on to make up for that lack of feature. Okay, so our example for step 5, a secretary had a 10-pound lifting restriction, but they had to get some bulk items that weighed more than that out of storage closets from time to time. The employer purchased a small lifting device that's meant to be used in office settings. But is that everything? No, it is not. Like we said before, that might need to be assembled and the individual might need to understand how it is used. If the individual has a lifting restriction and this device is going to help with that, how does the person operate it? Is there a foot crank that this person has to use in order to crank that stuff up off the floor? Is it electric? Does it need batteries? These are all questions that the individual needs to know so that they know how to use the item. And of course, for something like this, the individual might need to have a specific path through the workplace where they can use this item. We don't want to crunch a coworker's toes as they're rounding a corner. So we want to have a specific path through the workplace so that way individuals know to avoid it so they don't get those crunched toes. Okay, and our final step here is monitoring the accommodation. Naturally, the whole point here is to ensure that it is effective. But of course, accommodations can stop being effective for a lot of different reasons. Maybe the individual's needs have changed. You know, medical needs are not static every situation. It might change, might get better or worse. The actual work that's being done in the position can change. Job descriptions change from time to time. Might have new duties added in, some duties taken away. That could affect the accommodation's effectiveness. The work location itself can change. You know, if they are working from home, that redirected airflow accommodation that they had in their work office, that's obviously going to change, right? Because they're not there anymore. Or if we're working out of a new building, we might need to set that up again so that way it will be effective. So there's a lot of different ways where an accommodation can stop being effective. And we need to kind of nip those issues in the bud before they make it completely ineffective, because we don't want to have that happen. Obviously, we want to repair and maintain the accommodations as needed. Office chairs do not last forever, as we all know. We need to make certain that we're giving them that open communication so that way they know, hey, the gas cylinder in my office chair is broken. I need it replaced. Happens a lot. We need to make certain they can do that. Okay, so for our example for step 6, we have an auditor who was provided speech recognition software as an accommodation a year ago. However, the employer purchased new database software and found out that this database is not compatible with the speech recognition the individual's been using for a while. So how could the employer have avoided that issue? Well, this is just the reason why step 6 is here. You know, if we're going to be changing the software that we're using, or if we're going to be changing things about how the work is done, we need to keep the accommodations people have in mind. So that way we can review other options or review workarounds in advance. So that way we don't implement this whole new system. It's going to be great. And then, oh, it's completely not working with this person and now they can't do their work. Oops. We want to avoid that if we can. So we want to make certain that we keep those things in mind. And even if we can't get it to work with this speech recognition, maybe we can find a different speech recognition that'll work instead. And then we can replace that accommodation to make it effective again. Okay, and that's our sample interactive process. Does anyone have any questions about that before we move on to our best practices for stay at work, return to work? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, one of the main things that we do is we help people brainstorm accommodation options. So we're not going to be able to like provide the accommodation for them, but we can be like, okay, so this person is telling you that they have this particular restriction. Here's a bunch of things on our website that we have to help with that. Does any of these things seem like it would work with your job that this person is doing?
But not both of them.
Oh, no, we can. If, if people call in, it's like, hey, we would like to have a conference call with our individual. Can we set that up in advance? Or sometimes people call in with them on the phone. It's like, hey, I have the individual in my office with me. Can I talk to a consultant? We want to brainstorm this together. We'd be like, sure.
When you guys are actually there, you answer the phone.
Yeah, exactly. We do.
Great, okay.
We try our best to be as accessible for people as possible. And, sometimes that means that we're talking to 3, 4, 5 different people at the same time, and that's okay. Yes, sir.
Will Dan travel to the presentation?
We have done that in the past. Obviously, that's something that you would need to contact our managers about. I'm fairly certain that it would be either Tracy DeFreitas, Linda Baptiste, or Ann Hirsch that you'd be talking to about that. But we do travel for conferences and also for smaller presentations too. So that's totally fine. We definitely do that. But that's something that you would need to get with them about so that way they can hammer out the details with you.
Conjunction with vocational rehab to help people find employment that they can do, or is that redundant?
We don't really do that, no. We focus pretty much exclusively on ADA rights and accommodation. So we can help people explore those things while they're looking for work, and then they can use that information to be like, okay, well, this would probably be easier to have in this sort of a field. But we don't help people with job searches. But if we do get questions from an individual who's in a job search, we do have like a packet email that we can send them for resources that can help them in that job search. So, if we don't answer a question, we try to give the best referrals that we can to help, even if it's outside of our realm. So if you ever have a question and you're not certain that we help with it, just ask. We might have something that'll put you in the right direction, even if it's not our wheelhouse. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, so number one thing that I think is important for stay at work, return to work is making use of our job descriptions. Now, obviously, the ADA doesn't specifically require that we have job descriptions, but they're a good thing to have for a variety of reasons. But of course, what do? They put it in writing what the content of the job is, what the nature of the job is, what the individual is going to be expected to do in the job so that they know whenever they apply for it, what they're signing up for. That's the whole point of that job description. And we need to make certain that that job description has the correct essential functions listed on the job. This can get a lot of employers tripped up. Job descriptions are one of those things that we kind of put on the wayside. It's like, yeah, this job has changed, but there's like 800,000 other things that we need to do. It's a really back burner kind of thing. Well, I mean, that's all understandable, but if we have a person with a disability applying for a job and you have inaccurate essential functions, that can lead to some headaches down the line too. So we do want to make certain that we're putting out that accurate information. So that way people can request accommodations if they need them, or if they know that it's not going to work, they don't waste that HR person's time applying for a job they know they can't do. So if we're not sure how to identify those essential functions, we could always do a job analysis, really dig into, okay, well, this is what the job description says. This is what the manager says the job is. This is what coworkers in the same job say that they do from every day. And that's a good way to identify this is what this job actually does. The job description is not the end all be all, and it does need to be updated periodically. Okay. So our situation here is we have a food service manager with a back impairment, and they were preparing to return back to their job after having back surgery. So in this situation, the employer provided a detailed job description that included all of the requirements of their job to them, and this information was used to provide some temporary modified duties, which allowed them to return to work much more quickly. They provided that job description that was very detailed to the doctor, and the doctor used that to provide some key things that the individual would need to return now. Any questions on this before we move on? Okay. So second thing that I think is important is that we need to avoid these 100% healed or restriction-free policies. So what is a 100% healed policy? For anyone that doesn't know, some employers have on the books that they don't allow anyone to return to work unless they have no medical restrictions. And a lot of the times employers have these things to avoid issues with like workers' comp, stuff like that. It's like, oh, well, this person has a lifting issue. Their job requires a lot of lifting. That opens us up to liability for workers' comp claims. So we just won't allow that. We want to avoid that though, because it is, like it says on the second bullet point, that would be a blanket exclusion. We're not doing that case-by-case accommodation review for the person. We're just saying, oh, you have a lifting restriction. Just let us know whenever you don't have that lifting restriction. We'll be happy to take you back. We're completely avoiding that conversation with that policy, and that's a big no-no. And also, as an aside with the first bullet point here, regarded as, keep in mind that someone can meet the definition of disability even if they currently do not have a medical issue or don't even have a history of a medical issue. If an employer regards them as a person with a disability, even if they don't have one, then that could still be a form of discrimination because they're assuming that they have a disability and treating them as though they do. So this could be a situation where even if the person actually doesn't have a disability, they might still be able to get some issues involved regarding this with the EEOC because they're being regarded as. And, you know, as we said, this does require case-by-case analysis. All ADA situations are always case-by-case. That's why we need to avoid those blanket policies. So for our situation here, we have a security guard who was ready to return to work, but they had a 50-pound lifting restriction. The employer had a 100% restriction-free policy, and the employee was denied return to work because they had a restriction that made it so they couldn't lift over 50 pounds. So in this situation, the individual actually cited some stuff from the ADA in a correspondence with their employer and requested a policy modification. They requested that this 100% restriction-free policy be modified for them as an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act, because they actually didn't need to do any essential functions of their job that required them to lift over 50 pounds. This was a situation like with the last slide where the job description wasn't up to date. This job didn't actually require them to lift over 50 pounds. So their restriction didn't actually impact their ability to do the work in any way. So because of that, the employer let them return to work.
But even if it did,
Mm-hmm.
even if it did, they can't have a 100% return.
Right.
They have to engage and determine whether they can accommodate.
Yes, absolutely. And also, even if, you know, this was the case, they did have a restriction of that lifting issue, the employer would still have to review accommodations to help them do the work anyway. You know, so in this situation, it was just really interesting because the individual's like, but I don't do anything that requires me to lift this much. So it's a good case of just showing why we want to avoid these policies altogether. Any questions before we move on? Okay. Okay, and number 3, we want to consider temporary accommodations. Now, like we say here on bullet point number 3, it could be an ADA violation if we don't do this, but it's unsure. The EEOC hasn't come out and specifically stated, yes, temporary accommodations must be considered in all situations. They haven't said that.
What would that look like? What would a mandatory temporary accommodation that doesn't allow you to perform all the essential functions of the job look like? Exactly.
Right, that's not something that they can really.
Litigated, nobody's going to address that.
Exactly, yeah. But it's also something where it is possible that if an employer doesn't do this, that could also be a violation too, because if it's super easy, if it's super simple, if it's not going to be an undue hardship, if it's only going to be for a couple of weeks.
And they can perform all the essential functions
Yep.
of the job. You're in trouble.
Yeah, exactly. So we want to make certain that we're considering it, even though it's not 100% yes, you have to, or no, you don't. Once again, err on the side of caution. If it's easy, let's just do it. And the reason why we want to do it is that it's beneficial for both parties too, and not just keeps the individual working or returning to work ASAP, but if the situation goes south for our employer, it does show that they're putting forth a very good faith effort to accommodate, because the individual, we don't know if we have to actually do it or not. It's not been litigated on. So we went ahead and did it anyway. It's very good faith effort there. So for our situation here, we have an employee who has recently been diagnosed with hypersomnia and takes new medications for that, but they continue to struggle to get to work on time because of this disability. The solution here was that her employer agreed to a temporary flexible schedule while they adjusted to the medication, since it was mostly the side effects that was causing the presenting problem here. We also explored some options to help the individual remain more alert throughout their workday too. In this situation, I don't recall if I actually took this specific call, but I did take one similar to it. There is a device called a doze alert. It was meant for truck drivers. If it notices that you are bobbing your head, it will vibrate on the side of your head to wake you back up. So that's something that might be helpful here, even if the person is able to make it in, if they're falling asleep at work, something like that can help them to not have that be an issue.
Can I just make a comment?
Yeah.
That if you're doing a temporary accommodation for a diagnosis change and they can't perform all the essential functions, that might be okay because it's just temporary.
Mhm.
But as soon as they extend it and then extend it, now you got a problem because they're not performing all the essential functions. And it's no longer temporary. It's now you don't have an end date, and then you're going to want to look at it more seriously.
Yeah, because in that situation, it's kind of being like, okay, well, we don't know, but it seems like it's more long-term than what we were originally thinking. And even though we can provide something short-term, that does not mean that we can provide it long-term. Undue hardship in that situation, if we were looking at it from that perspective, obviously it's a lower burden to do things from a short period of time than it is to do things for a long period of time. So if it's something that we reviewed it for temporary and it's becoming more long-term, well, that might be time to kind of revisit that analysis. Any questions before we move on? Or comments? Comments are fine too. Okay. All right, so our next topic here is what is light duty under the ADA? A lot of the times whenever we're throwing around that term light duty, we're talking about it from a perspective of workers' compensation light duty. That's what most people are familiar with whenever we're talking about light duty, but it is used under the ADA sometimes because you can do similar things to light duty under the ADA with accommodations. Now, obviously, the ADA doesn't require you to create positions for people as an accommodation. Workers' comp might, ADA does not. So we don't have to just wave our magic wand and will a position into existence for someone as an accommodation, but we might need to reassign them into a vacant workers' compensation position, even if those are normally set aside for people who have workers' comp claims, because that would just be an additional policy modification accommodation. We normally only allow people in these positions due to workers' comp. Well, let's modify that policy then. Might be something that we can do, but that doesn't mean we have to keep that person in there any longer than we would for someone under workers' comp. We'd still follow everything else, just that particular policy might need to be changed. But we can also restructure the original position too as an accommodation. We can mirror that light duty that they need in the existing job sometimes by modifying how an essential function is done or when it is done, or if it's a marginal function of the job, we could potentially look at reallocating those things to other workers as an accommodation. Especially if it's short term, we could restructure that so that way it's going to be, a lot more of a less physically demanding position for maybe 2 weeks, a month or two, depending on what you can do and handle. But we could do that as an accommodation for someone to make it so that they can return to work.
So you're saying that that this is relatively known that Jen got involved in the duty stuff, and I understand why. But are you saying that Jan is suggesting that it's okay to modify the current job
Mhm.
to match the restriction requirements, similarly to a light duty position, temporarily, if they can still perform all the essential functions?
Yes, that would be
But they
fine.
need to be able to perform the essential functions. You're not
Right.
suggesting that the modification of their normal job should be modified light duty, so they're no longer performing the essential functions.
Right.
Okay.
Because in that situation, we're probably fundamentally altering that
Correct.
job,
Right.
and we don't have to
Thank
do
you for
that.
clarifying.
Yeah, because if we're fundamentally altering a job, that's one way that we can determine undue hardship. Because if it's something where this job isn't even the same job anymore because we've restructured it so much, isn't that kind of the same thing as creating a new position? We don't have to do that. So it's kind of a balancing act, but it is something that we want to keep in our toolbox because it's a useful tool when we can do it. So in this situation, we have a maintenance worker with a 10-pound lifting restriction. They had a job that was physically well beyond what their medical restrictions could handle, though. The employer wanted some information on how to generate a light duty position for this person. So we provided them information on the definitions of light duty and accommodations for light duty positions. The employer, they actually had a vacant delivery driver position. So they reassigned that person into that more lighter duty position as an accommodation. Since it was already vacant, the person was actually out on, I think, either medical or maternity leave. So they already had a need for that delivery driver work to be done. So they were like, well, let's just shift him over here. And then we don't have to worry about hiring in a temp for, the 3 months or whatever it was that the person was going to be out. Simple.
The real point is you cannot reserve jobs for this workers' comp. They're for everybody.
Yes, yes. That policy of this is only a workers' compensation job is just a policy that can be modified as an accommodation. Yes, sir. So generally speaking, light duty positions are temporary jobs. Like if they're workers' compensation light duty jobs, they're going to have an end date where the person will be removed from it. But if we're talking about job restructuring, it's entirely possible that we could permanently restructure that job depending upon what the business needs are for that job to exist. So that's why it's important to keep in mind that if we're talking about light duty, what law are we actually talking about? What rules are we following? Because typically under workers' comp, that would be a temporary thing, generally. But ADA, maybe not. It depends upon what the business needs are and what the medical needs are, just like any other accommodation would be. Okay, like we talked about before, job restructuring is a powerful tool. We kind of already went over this, but just to recap, you can reallocate marginal job duties to other workers as an accommodation, or you can restructure how essential functions are done to be able to do them in a different way. And of course, you might need to provide additional accommodations in addition to this. If we cannot reallocate an essential function because it's something that's actually essential to this job, we still need to review accommodations to make it so that they can do those essential functions. So we might need to provide a lifting device or some other thing that would enable them to be able to do it. Just because one thing doesn't work doesn't mean that we can stop there, basically. So our situation here is that we have a teacher with seasonal affect disorder, and she was experiencing some extreme fatigue due to the change in the seasons. It was becoming winter, and also she had a recent change in her medication too, so a double whammy there. In this situation, the teacher was temporarily accommodated with the removal of 2 of their extra duties. The employer found no hardship in removing them, and also they had plenty of other workers there that could handle the early and late bus duties during the winter months. So it was only for a couple months out of the year anyway. So the person was able to do it at any other time, but in the winter, they were just removed from that rotation. Okay, transitionary work arrangements. So these are the sort of situations where a doctor will say, this person can return to work with these restrictions, and eventually they will be able to return to their full duties. So Under the ADA, this would be a situation where, once again, there's no set requirement on this. This isn't built into the law, but this can help someone return to work much more quickly, because if they get in there and are doing some things, this is enabling them to get back into the flow. And once they kind of pick up that and get the ball rolling, they can return to that full duty a lot easier than if they're doing absolutely nothing and then they're going right back into doing full duty. Sometimes that's a whole lot to get used to all at once. Yeah.
But you are not calling this an ADA accommodation.
No.
And that's incredibly important.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
new
Because-
policy that will sort of help you with traditionally for everybody who qualifies before we go into the interactive process and actually determine whether we can accommodate.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not really an accommodation because, like we talked about before, wouldn't this be technically creating a temporary position for this person?
Plus they're not performing all these things.
Right. So, this really isn't a accommodation, but it definitely has a lot of benefits for both parties involved, which is why we wanted to talk about it here, because it can obviously benefit the employee from the medical standpoint, but also the employer probably has work that needs to be done that this individual can do now. And it's like, hey, why make the other workers suffer whenever this person can come in for 3 hours out of their typical 8-hour workday and do these tasks? You might not have to do it as an accommodation, but there's a little benefit to the business. So why not consider it? In this situation, we had a custodian with a knee injury, was able to work, but not at their full capacity. He asked to return part-time and to gradually increase his hours back up to full-time. So he wasn't asking for any change in his work duties, just a reduced schedule and then building back up to full-time. In this situation, the employer did agree to that, stated that it would only last for 4 weeks, and the expectation was that at the end of those 4 weeks, the individual would be back to their full-time status. Don't know if that actually happened in this situation. A lot of times people only call us when they're having a problem. So we don't know if it worked out, but since we didn't hear anything else, it's usually safe to say that it did. Okay. Next topic here is plans of action. So like we were talking about before, what is a plan of action? Literally, it's just a plan that we put into place for how to manage emergencies that happen at work. And those can be emergencies that happen for non-medical reasons too. That whole thing that we have posted on every wall in our hotel that shows you where you need to go in the event of a fire because the elevators aren't working. That's also technically a plan of action. But this is specifically for whenever someone needs a specific plan of action as an accommodation. Like we were talking about before with the seizures. How does the employer respond to this person having a seizure? Do we need to call 911 every time? Do we need to give this person specific medication? Like if they're having they're diabetic and they're low blood sugar, do we need to give them medication or food? In the event of this just randomly happening, no one's going to know what to do. So we want to set up that plan of action so that way we have specific people who have specific tasks so that if it happens, there's not as much panic. These are just some informations that we could include in that plan of action. I won't go through them all with you because obviously it's going to be situational, heavily situational. One thing that we do talk about a lot as from an individual who has seizures, a lot of the times employers are very, very cautious about those and they want to call 911 every time that it happens. So in that situation, we would have a conversation with them about, okay, well, let's have the doctor provide information on how to identify the seizures. What does the individual feel that they can tell that it's coming on so that they know it is a seizure that's happening and not something else. So that way, maybe the employer doesn't have to do it if they can identify these things objectively. It's like, oh, okay, this isn't a heart attack. This isn't anything else. It's just another seizure. So we don't need to force this individual to pay an unnecessary ambulance bill. That's something that we can build into it, but obviously it needs to be very clear and very specific for that because obviously we want our workers to be safe. So calling 911 makes sense from the employer's perspective. We need to help them be able to clearly identify it if we want to remove that from the plan of action, which a lot of individuals like that, but they also don't want to get real super detailed either. And this is a situation where we might need to be a little bit more detailed than usual if they want that specifically. Okay, so reassignment, it is really the accommodation that everyone loves. It always the one that we think about first, isn't it? And of course, it can be a temporary or a permanent reassignment. There's no requirement under the ADA that it has to be permanent. We can review temporary ones, just like anything else, we can review it temporarily. And also if the need is a temporary need, we want to match the accommodation to that need. So we don't want to permanently reassign someone whenever they're only going to have restrictions for a couple months due to like, a knee surgery or something. That doesn't really seem necessary. Well, like we said before, the ADA doesn't require employers to create positions, but if they want to, they can. They don't have to, but they can. It can be really useful whenever we're exploring options to help the individual in their current job. So this is a situation where we'd be like, hey, maybe a temporary assignment is what you need, because sometimes accommodations are a lengthy process to figure out what's going to help them. It can be a long time to work through that long-term accommodation need. So how do we help them now? And that can be a temporary reassignment to a position that the individual can do for a month or two until that permanent accommodation is in place. And, sometimes reassignment really is just the best option for everyone. If typically speaking, we want to review accommodations in the current job. We want to keep the person in the current job. But if the individual wants a reassignment and the employer agrees that reassignment is best, then we can review that reassignment first. That's totally fine. Just like we said before, we want to give the individual's preference primary consideration. And this is one situation where we might deviate from your typical script because the individual wants a reassignment. So we can review that first if that's what they want. Yes, sir. Generally speaking, there wouldn't be a competitive thing. Like the person wouldn't have to compete for the position, because that wouldn't be a very effective accommodation where it's like, okay, you need another job. So, go compete for it like everyone else. Like, what's the accommodation there? But, it is something where the employer would need to get some information on to ensure that the person is qualified for that job, right? If this is very different from their existing position, they might need to make certain that they have the right experience for it, they have the right education for it. So they might need to provide a resume, or might need to provide some information from the application so if they need it. But it's not something where it's just, okay, well, we're just going to transfer you and here's our typical transfer process. We need to actually make certain we're providing the accommodation, and usually means that we just place them into the role and it's given to them. They're not competing for it. Yeah.
Have you heard anything about this, that there is scuttlebutt that that's going to be modified a little bit, that once they meet the expectations of the job, they have the skills and abilities, that they still have to not really compete for it, but they have to show that they're qualified enough based on the other candidates that are applying?
I haven't heard anything about that.
Heard anything about that
Yeah,
yet?
no,
Okay.
I haven't heard anything about
So
that.
we're really expecting to just place them in a job.
Yeah. Yeah.
They get qualified, even at the minimum level, they get the job.
Right. Now, one thing that's important to keep in mind here is pay, right? So if we're looking at a reassignment and there's a whole bunch of different jobs that are vacant, we have a pick of the litter. Okay, well, how do we pick the right one for the first time? So we want to start off by choosing an option that's going to be equivalent to the existing job. Like, we don't want to force a pay decrease on someone whenever there's one that would be closer. We don't have to generally consider one that would be considered a promotion, though, so we don't have to reassign them into a better paying job necessarily, but we want to review those equivalent ones first. And if there isn't any equivalent, then we can start going down that pay ladder to find the one that's as close as possible.
So you said necessarily, we absolutely do not need to put them into a promotion.
Correct. It's just sometimes promotion is a weird term. So that's why I say we have to be careful about it, because I've had some situations where the employer's like, but this is a promotion. And I'm like, okay, well, let's just do a little bit of thought exercise. How is it a promotion? Because what you're telling me is that the pay is the same, the work is largely the same, there's no additional benefits to this job. How is that a promotion then? Because we don't want to get bogged down on the labels and the language if it's not actually functionally a promotion. But if it is one, absolutely, we don't have to provide that actual promotion. Yes, sir. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it definitely is, because they're like that makes total sense for the employer to be like, we want the best person possible in the job. That's a totally valid thing. We want the best people to do the best work for us. Every employer wants that, but at the same time, we need to make certain that we have an obligation to follow the ADA too. So just because this person might not have all of that same experience, they might not have those additional, cherry on top degrees, that doesn't mean the person won't be effective in the role. Because that's what all of those cherries on top are ultimately helping the employer figure out who's going to do the job the best, who's going to be effective in the job. And just because someone doesn't have that extra training or that extra work experience, that extra education, doesn't mean that they're not going to be effective. They just might need a little bit more time, which, we already usually give time for training in our new jobs. It's totally fine.
No, this is about an employer saying, I want to hire the best person in this job, and AD is saying, so what?
Mhm.
Hire the person who's disabled first, period. And then what's the other question? If you've got somebody who's disabled and I went to an EEOS presentation that I think said this, so I'm not sure.
Okay.
That if you've got a disability that is a physical or mental disability, you have priority over a disability that is, or over accommodation. And then I'm probably asking the wrong question because this is not disproving. Or an accommodation that is a religious accommodation. Do you know the answer to that question?
No, we don't normally follow like the case law sort of thing and stuff like that.
Because you're physical and mental. So
Yeah.
I asked the wrong question. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. It's totally fine. I love having that open dialogue though. It's totally okay. Did you have another question?
That's a good point. I think a lot of it's training HR personnel.
Mhm. Yeah. Because it makes sense from their perspective. We want to have that best person, but just because the people don't have those additional degrees doesn't mean they're not going to work out well. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Uh-huh. Right, because this person has that insider knowledge. They know how the processes work at the employer already. And that's going to be part of our onboarding and our training that we don't have to do for someone who is an internal reassignment. So that's a leg up that this person has, even if they don't have that other degree. Any other questions or comments? Okay. All right, and of course, our favorite topic of leave. We can't have an accommodation of return to work, stay at work without leave because, hey, that's kind of the whole point, right? We want to avoid that leave as much as we can with these programs. So like we talked about before, leave can be provided under a whole bunch of different laws, and we need to make certain that we're reviewing those laws individually and together to make certain that we're providing the best protection to the individual. Every law has their own rules for the leave that they provide. Some of them have better protections than others depending upon the situation. So we don't want to default to FMLA, for instance, if ADA would be better. We don't want to default to ADA if FMLA would be better. We want to review everything and provide the one that gives the best protection for this specific situation. And this second point, I just wanted to point out because there's often a lot of confusion here. ADA leave does not have to be continuous. It can be intermittent. If someone has a gastrointestinal problem and they need to go into the restroom for like an extra 2 hours out of their workday, obviously that's going to fall outside of their paid breaks. but we can provide intermittent leave or a flexible schedule accommodation to make up that time as an accommodation. And that's a situation where we would want to consider that intermittent leave. There's nothing under the ADA stating it has to be continuous in every situation. And of course, ADA leave is job protected, but job protected depends upon the law we're talking about, what that means in the minutia of the details. So for instance, under FMLA, I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but if someone is out on FMLA leave, under FMLA, sometimes it can be perfectly fine for someone to be brought back into a similar job, but not necessarily the exact same job. You know, same job title, but might be a different position. Under the ADA, the job protection is for the specific position itself. So if we're looking at returning this person back to work, we first want to make certain that we can return them to their current job. But if it is an undue hardship to do that because we needed to fill that position while they were out, then we would look into a reassignment of what job they would be returned into. It's kind of a different process. There's an extra step there that's important. Obviously, if someone is FMLA eligible, we can't force them to stay at work, but under ADA, like we talked about, employers get to choose the accommodation. So if we're asking for leave, the employer is totally okay to ask, is there any way that we can accommodate you to keep you at work? Under FMLA, if someone wants leave, the employer kind of just has to say, okay, well, here's your leave. We'll see you when you get back. But under ADA, they can have that dialogue. And naturally, we don't want to force someone to take ADA leave instead of accommodations. This can be tricky though, because sometimes we need time to figure out what's going to help, but we don't want to force them to take leave as a policy. You know, someone requests an accommodation and it's like, okay, well, we're going to need time to figure out what's going to help. So we're going to place you on leave until the process is complete. Remember what we talked about before with the temporary accommodations. We want to consider that so that way we minimize the leave as much as possible. And along the same lines, we don't want to force them to take leave simply because we haven't completed the interactive process yet.
Well, wait a minute though, because if they're in an environment where they're going to be unsafe and we can't.
Oh, sure.
Them, they're going on leave and
yeah.
getting their interactive process over whether they want to or not.
Right. Yeah.
We don't have a job for them and they can't be in the workforce and that's safe.
Right. If it's a safety issue, like it's a direct threat level of a safety issue, absolutely. We don't have to just keep people in the position if it's not safe for them to be there and we can verify that objectively. That's fine. That's what direct threat is for. But if there isn't a verifiable direct threat level safety issue, that might be something that the employer has to consider. Because a lot of the times our safety concerns are kind of like gut feelings or fears that we don't really have any objective evidence for. You want to get very detailed and specific on that. So in that situation, we need to look at what happens whenever the individual is having a seizure. You know, like we said before, does the individual get sensations? Can they tell, oh, a seizure is coming on? In that situation, we can minimize a lot of the safety issue by saying, I feel it coming on, and then they go to a place where they can have the seizure without hurting themselves as much. But if they don't have those warning signs and it just happens, that's a different situation because that person could literally be walking down the stairs and then all of a sudden, boom, seizure comes on. That's a wholly different situation than if they have forewarning. Because if they can go to like a safe area where they can have it and just get through it, that's a very different safety level risk than someone who can just have it whenever without warning.
And just a comment, it depends on the job. So a safety officer isn't going to inherit a gun with seizure, period.
Right.
You're going to have a job description that say, these are things that you cannot have, period, and it doesn't matter anything else. And then everything else, you got to really figure out the degree of harm and risk.
But if the person did not disclose that they had seizures,
Doesn't matter. As soon as you know the medical condition, you're taking it. You never say, well, you never told us. That never happened.
Yeah. It's very like, it's understandable to be like, but we didn't know about this. And that is definitely frustrating. But we need to remember that individuals don't have to unless they need accommodations. And if this person was like, I don't really feel like I need it. I feel like I can do this. I don't need to do this. That's okay. It's their choice. But once you know that an accommodation is needed, then it's like, okay, we need to have this conversation. That's whenever you start it up on your end rather than waiting for them to come to you. Okay, and we can't talk about leave without talking about indefinite leave requests. So indefinite leave, obviously we can review extensions of leave, but there is no obligation to grant indefinite leave. So if we don't have that time frame, if we don't know how long it's going to last, that's obviously something they don't have to consider. And sometimes extension after extension can become an indefinite leave request. So it's something to keep in mind that we need to consider leave, but we don't have to consider indefinite leave. How much time do I have? 7 minutes. Okay. I can get through this last slide then in that amount of time. I'm going to keep you guys for as long as I can. No. So undue hardship and leave requests. I wanted to point this one out because the EEOC did provide some good data on how to identify undue hardship whenever it's about leave requests. So obviously, leave can be disruptive to the workplace. And the real thing that we want to look into is how frequent it happens, if it's unpredictable, and how much of a strain it's going to place on the business as a whole. Those are the main things we're looking at for leave requests under undue hardship. So obviously, if that employer doesn't have a sufficient number of employees to accomplish the work, there's not enough coworkers to pass the work off onto, that could be an undue hardship. If there is not enough people to meet the goals or to service the customers, like if we're talking about the DMV, for instance, if there's not enough people to man those areas to make certain people can get in and out before close, that can be an undue hardship. Well, obviously, we would need to shift work around to other employees, but if that shifting of work makes it so the individuals can't do their own job, they're taking on so many extra duties that they can't get their own work done, that could be an undue hardship. And naturally, if it's causing a significant cost because of overtime pay or paying for a temp or other things like that, that can be factored into. So I'll go ahead and stop here.